I'm with Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa, India's ambassador to Japan from 2012 to 2015, and Swasti Rao, Associate Fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis right here in New Delhi, and somebody who holds an adjunct position at the Tokai University in Japan. And today, of course, we're discussing or talking about the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, almost as if a member of India's family has passed away. Both of you who have studied and worked in Japan very closely, know the Japanese well, know Japanese society intimately. Ambassador Wadhwa, may I start with you first and ask you, you knew former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe personally. Tell me a little bit about your meetings with him and what the impact of his death, of his assassination on that country as well as on India-Japan relations.
Thank you, Jyoti. Very sad circumstances to be on this program and to be talking about Prime Minister Abe. I mean, I think a lot of us took it, as something that was a personal loss. And nobody has really said it as well as our Prime Minister when he said, we mourn him as one of our own, just as he embraced us with an open heart. There is not a lot of emotion in international relations or in bilateral relations, but I think it was really Prime Minister Abe who conferred on this relationship between India and Japan and an emotional connect. And I say it, as you say, with a certain amount of emotion. When I landed there in 2012, it had been, Fukushima had just happened and Japan was really going through, a crisis on several fronts, economic, on several fronts with prime ministers changing every year and so on. And I was there, I still remember I was in Toyama, and where there's a Japan-India Association at a meeting, and we were very closely following what was happening with the LDP leadership elections. And then they said it was going to be Prime Minister Abe. He had won, not the first, but I think the second or third round. And, we all were so excited. And from that point, I think, he came back and he impacted every aspect of Japan's domestic relationship, Japan's stature in the world, our bilateral relationship. And, it seems too soon to talk of his legacy, were it not for the fact of what happened, the sad thing that happened yesterday. But, when we look back, we'll find that there was really no aspect of Japan's standing in the world that wasn't impacted by this absolutely, colossus of a man, who was there for Japan. And I think Japanese today are really in deep mourning, and we reach out to them in this hour of their grief.
Absolutely. That was very beautifully said, Ambassador. Swasti Rao, you studied in Japan from 2010 to 2015. You speak the language. You were there as a student. Tell me a little bit about, what did Prime Minister Shinzo Abe mean for Japan?
Well, good morning, Jyoti, and good morning, Ambassador Wadhwa. It is indeed. I mean, it's lovely to get together with people who have served in Japan and know the society well. But what a reason has brought us together today. I also was there, and I was there on a different scholarship called the Okita Memorial Scholarship. And then I came back to India. Then I got this next, scholarship that is given by the Japanese Education Ministry. And then I landed again. And, Fukushima had just happened, and we were all very wary of going back to Japan, and, especially in India, because we are not really used to seeing earthquakes as much. So, you land there, and then 2012, Abe comes back again, because that's a second stint, right? So, like I said, that, when the second administration of Abe, when he comes back again, and 2012 to 20 is when he is actually doing all these things to transform Japan. So he's been the longest serving prime minister. We've been hearing this again and again. And you know why it's important? Because somebody who keenly observes Japanese politics knows that, in Japan, the prime ministers come and go in a revolving door policy. So it's very difficult for a prime minister to stay more than a year. Very few actually complete their terms. So in such a scenario, there comes a man who's, prime minister 3 times, and not just 3 times, also the longest serving. So this 2012 to 20 is that time where actually this transformative importance of Abe for Japan can't be overstated. Okay, so he's definitely one of the Japan's most strategically alert prime ministers. So the kind of decisions he took, especially about institutional changes, the economic changes, changes, the famous Abenomics, the three arrows of the Abenomics. And it must be, actually, I think it must be conveyed that even now, Bank of Japan is actually following certain policies of his Abenomics. Right. And then what he did about creating the National Security Council and about, upping the defense posturing of Japan. So those are things that were very, very difficult in Japan to, to do because of the Article 9 and all of that. So, I would just say that I think my first, comment would be that he's been the most strategically alert prime minister who's brought about institutional changes and brought about a personality of Japan that we are familiar with today and the world knows Japan for, at least in the modern time.
Yeah. Ambassador Wadhwa, I want to bring you actually straight away to the 2007 visit of Prime Minister Abe to India. And, his speech in the Parliament, in the Central Hall of Parliament, that's something that I think older journalists like us remember so clearly. And I believe his speechwriter, a gentleman called Tomohiko Taniguchi. I've been reading up about him, and he talks so much about Vivekananda and Sister Nivedita. Now, what is this? On one hand, Japan is this highly industrialized society. On the other hand, they're talking about, Indian philosophers like Vivekananda and Sister Nivedita. What does this mean for Japan? And why do you think Prime Minister Abe used this phrase in that 2007 speech?
That's true, Jyoti, because with that speech in our joint session of Parliament in 2007, he gave birth to the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And I know, diplomats like us who've been around for a while remember when India was out of the construct, as it were, of the Asia-Pacific. It ended somewhere in Myanmar with ASEAN, and, we were kind of almost deliberately kept out. And it was really Prime Minister Abe, with that speech and his policies, when he came back, that made us part of this dynamism of this whole region, and both in economic terms and in terms of security.
How does he do that? When you say kept out by whom? And how does he do this? What does confluence of the two seas mean?
No, basically what he said was that the India and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean were a continuum, and was that you couldn't have a sort of separate construct that were nationally a continuum. And, those are geopolitical reasons, they're geoeconomic reasons, their dependency on oil from the Gulf and so on. But he was also talking about India and Japan as two important bookends of Asia, and that we were joined by the oceans rather than divided. And Asia-Pacific was, of course, if you think of APEC and so on, where they always talked about the Asia-Pacific. And that was, you looked at from the shores of the US to ASEAN, China and East Asia. But India was never part of that. So to that extent, including India in the changes that were happening in the world order, the changes that were happening regionally, it was really due to Prime Minister Abe. And now everybody talks of FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific. And it was he's sort of the person, the progenitor in a way of that. But you asked me about traditional, about Japan and how it's an industrialized modern country, but it's also very traditional. And there are people who value, in fact, there is common Asian values. They value personal connects. And here I'll take you back to what Prime Minister Abe has said publicly, and he said personally also, about his connect with India starting very early, and what he learned of India at the knee of his grandfather, Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, who came to India in 1957. That period in the 50s, starting from 52, when India didn't go to the San Francisco conference, we signed a separate treaty with them, established diplomatic relations in 1952, and a flurry of visits on both sides. And 1957 is the year Prime Minister Nehru goes to Japan, and Prime Minister Kishi comes. And apparently, Prime Minister Kishi used to tell Prime Minister Abe as a child, he heard stories of how Prime Minister Nehru took him by his hand, and there was a sea of people. You can imagine in India what happens, to get large numbers. And for Japanese, that was been quite surprising. A sea of people, and he held up his hand, and he said, "This is the Prime Minister of Japan. This is a country I greatly respect." And you must understand, this is not empty words. This is a time when Japan is really kind of a pariah state after the war. And when they offered ODA, nobody wanted to take ODA. So India was the first country to be given and accept ODA from Japan, which later became really the most important part of our relationship for a very long time, till this change in 2000. So there was an emotional connect, and he'd have to talk about it, and that how it was so special. India was so special to him because, to begin with, the association with his father. And then he continued this. And I think this is, there are a lot, and when you talk to the Japanese, they do know about the Buddhism connect. And I have to tell you this, Jyoti, as we talk, that it was for me very ironical that this happened in Nara. And that was because Nara was where we know of the first connect with India. And this was Bodhisena, as the Japanese call him, which was a Buddhist monk who went to Nara. And there he consecrated, a huge bronze statue of the Buddha. And he's so associated with Nara. So for every visiting Indian ambassador, one of the first places of call is Nara. We still have the Todaiji temple. And you have this place associated with Bodhisena. And to think that it had to happen there, it couldn't be a more peaceful, beautiful little town that there is, that it should have happened there. I mean, that really, really is something which is very painful.
You're absolutely right. Nara is a little gorgeous. I mean, it's like a little jewel, I think. Very fortunate to have been there. Ms. Rao, can I ask you about, Ambassador Wadhwa referred to the ODA, or the Overseas Development Assistance, that Japan has offered or has been offering to India since the 1950s. But I remember after India's nuclear tests in 1998, when Japan withdrew or froze the ODA. Now, talk to me a little bit about what that meant. And also, interestingly, India never responded in any, there was no anger or anything at all after that, although the rest of the Western world had imposed sanctions on India after the nuclear tests. But talk to me a little about this special India-Japan relationship, which doesn't come in the way of any other relationship that India has in the world.
Yes, absolutely, Jyoti. So we need to put a few things into perspective, right? I mean, for most Indians, what does Japan stand for, apart from manga and the tea ceremony and the temples at Kyoto and the Mount Fuji? So we are natural partners, and I think you talk to anybody who's worked on Japan and India would say that we have been unable to harness the true potential, of our natural friendship. And
what does that mean?
Natural friendship means what Ambassador Wadhwa was just talking about, that, it's not just the anti-China emotion or the threat that we face from China and China's territorial claims, which binds us together. There's a far deeper emotional, civilizational, religious connect, which goes back and beyond, right, about China. But most of the things that we talk about today are only stemming from the fact that I think India and Japan need to be together because, that serves our mutual interest with respect to countering China. So I think it's not that it's false, it's just that it doesn't really capture the true essence of what this natural friendship can entail. And you mentioned the ODA. You see, the ODA is the Official Development Assistance, and ODA was a kind of a diplomatic tool. You see, Japan was the second largest economy after the US in the 60s, especially after income doubling plan, etc. really took off in Hatoyama cabinet. And this is like 60s, 70s, Japan was doing very well. And then Japan wanted to reach out, and Japan was the soft power. If you remember, the entire concept of Japan as a soft power, the Joseph Nye, book on soft power actually took Japan as an example. So they wanted to reach out to the world, and they said that they are reaching out. And now just understand how intrinsically the ODA concept is different from China is doing with respect to the BRI, right? China is actually going and claiming territory and doing all sorts of debt trap diplomacy with the BRI, which also is an economic assistance, in a way. But look at Japan. I mean, Japan never did that. Japan actually offered the world, official development assistance, which was, which were loans. Japan offered that to China as well in the opening up after 78. Japan offered that to India. And then India became the largest recipient of Japanese ODA. Now, herein, I think I need to highlight on something. You see, as long as Japan was giving India ODA, we were still not equal partners, I mean, of course, Japan always had this fondness for India and vice versa because of our democratic setup, because of our, ties with respect to civilization, Buddhism, etc. Also with respect to how our societies function, which are, primarily patriarchal and
right.
But at the same time, you see a change happening there around the time of 2000 when India is becoming a more equal partner. So you mentioned, that Japan also withdrew its support after India's nuclear test. But understand that it's the same Japan that, with whom we had a civil nuclear deal in 2015 after Prime Minister Modi took up here and Shinzo Abe was Prime Minister in Japan, right? And we are still not part of nuclear supplies group. So I think the problem happened because we were unable to, and Japan was in a different part of the world, and then they were looking at their ties with America and how they are trying to balance their economic ties and their diplomatic and territorial tensions with China. So it seemed like they are in a different part of the world, and India. I think the problem happened because there was a communication gap. Okay. The more we started to be thrown together, like a confluence of the two seas, that the seas do not join, do not separate, but join us. Since that consciousness started to take root, India started to get treated as a more equal partner to Japan. And the partnership, the strategic partnership that started from 2000 when Prime Minister Modi visited India after a long hiatus, and then Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, that legacy was really taken up in full blow, by Shinzo Abe. And then obviously the bonhomie and the camaraderie that was there, in Shinzo Abe and Prime Minister Modi, or Shinzo Abe and Prime Minister Trump and Shinzo Abe. I mean, you pick up anyone, he's an extremely popular person. So his personality out there is extremely important, for that sort of, joining and for that, harnessing of the true potential when it comes to. So I think that is an important point that we need to understand.
Right. Ambassador Wadhwa, you referred to how Prime Minister Abe sat on the lap of his grandfather and he told him stories about his visit to India. But tell me, and if you can perhaps connect this, that you refer to the Tokyo trials that India's jurist at the time, Radhavinod Pal, who gave the dissenting judgment. Talk to me a little bit about how India refused to criticize the Japanese at the Tokyo trials, and connect that, if you can, to what's going on in the current modern day relationship between India and Japan.
So Jyoti, yes, Justice Radhavinod Pal is really a hero in Japan. And, a lot of Indians don't know about him, but I think every child in Japan does. And we very often, I would be greeted by people who would say, "Oh, are you Indian?" And then one of the first names that came up was Justice Pal. Because as you know, they were the Tokyo trials, which was a tribunal like there was Nuremberg for the Germans and the Axis powers of the West. And so this was for Japan. And, there were jurists. So this wasn't India's position. There happened to be an Indian jurist, and this happened to be Radhavinod Pal. And, his dissenting judgment, because this basically looked at not only a long list of, people who were on trial, but, and including among them was the name of Prime Minister Abe's grandfather, whom I mentioned. But, it was also the atrocities of what the Japanese had done. And his dissenting judgment at that point of time, where he looked at it and said, really was, war per se at that point of time wasn't a crime in international law. So he took a legalistic point, but he also, he felt that you were looking at a country, giving it an unequal treatment because you were looking at them as people who had been defeated in the war. So as you know, in the famous or the infamous Yasukuni Shrine, which is very close to the Indian embassy in Tokyo, there is a bust of Radhavinod Pal, of Justice Radhavinod Pal, with parts of his judgment which are there in English and Japanese and other languages for you to read. And I'll add another little anecdote to this, Jyoti, which would interest people who hear that on one of his visits, Prime Minister Abe, and I can't quite remember the year, whether it was while he was as Prime Minister or between when he'd again come to India in 2011, he went to Calcutta and he met the family of Justice Pal.
So this is 2007 when he first came to India.
It was one of the, I cannot remember exactly. Yes, he went. He went. And it was, so, he was a patriot. I feel a little pained because people have been talking about him as an ultra-nationalist, whatever. This is from the Western perspective, as the way they see Japan. We don't see Japan like that in India. And for us, he was really a patriot who did, who really believed in Japan and Japan's position in the world. So Abe certainly must have been influenced by that. If you remember, there was also controversy to begin with because of his visits to Yasukuni himself, that he did go a couple of times. And, therefore, there was this association, with the right wing, but it wasn't. I think he did what was really best for for Japan. But then there is that connect with India. And besides, Justice Radhavinod Pal, there's lots of little things. I told you about the San Francisco conference, where they all remember the fact that India wasn't with them at that point, moment of humiliation. In fact, we decided not to attend at all. Prime Minister Nehru decided not to attend at all. Another wonderful story a lot of Japanese tell you is that, after the war, everything was destroyed, and Tokyo was completely destroyed. And so was the zoo. And then we presented an elephant to the zoo. And so many Japanese would say, after the war, our children were very sad, and the Indian elephant brought a smile to the face of our children. So there is an emotional content in that relationship. But I think, beyond everybody, I think Prime Minister Abe, to an extent, Prime Minister Modi also, you talked about him, about his legacy. And in 2000, I remember he was the one who decided, after the sanctions of our tests and so on, that, they wanted to not really normalize, but go beyond that, have a more substantive relationship with India, because somewhere between 1960 and about 2000, the relationship was basically had become something of, I call it stasis, because nothing really was happening. There was ODA and a few things here and there, few visits here and there. There would be gaps of over 20 years between visits between prime ministers, and from there you find to what we have now is that we have annual summits, between India and Japan. And really, for Japan, India is the only country where they have summits of this sort. I must also mention to you, that apparently, I haven't read it personally, but Prime Minister Abe, in his memoirs, has mentioned, which was written, I think, after he stepped down from office, and he said that the India-Japan relationship was so important that it could overtake in importance the Japan-US relationship in time. So, this was a man who really, really, I think from his heart, believed in the importance of this relationship, and not in the context, as Swasti makes a very important point. We see it in the context of what has happened in China, the changing, the geopolitical environment. I think Japan-India relations has an intrinsic, innate importance of its own. And that was recognized by Prime Minister.
But why does it have this intrinsic, innate importance that Prime Minister Abe recognized? India is a poor country compared to Japan. Japan is this highly sort of industrialized, very rich nation. What is it that he saw?
Well, as Swasti was mentioning, to begin with, it's not only what Prime Minister Abe saw. The fact is, everybody knows. There is the religious connect. There is a cultural connect as Asians. But I think more in recent times, also the fact of both of us being democracies and therefore being bound by same values. And if you look at the complementarity, the economic complementarities are just huge. In every way. Look at the problem that they're having with their demography. Then look at what is happening with India. We are one of the youngest populations. We're a huge market. So these are all, the more practical aspects. There's a complementarity on almost every level as far as the economic relationship goes. And unfortunately, this is something which needs to be still worked on and realized. So I think there was that realization, certainly. But there were all these other strands that came together and said, if you look at, at Asia, and you look at which is the other major country which ascribes the same values as you do, and with which you have no baggage of history, and this is very important, because Japan carried this baggage of history with most of them. If you look at Southeast Asia, because of the war, there was no baggage of history, between the two of us. And there is a huge amount of trust. Today, as we look at this relationship, and everything is really attributable to Prime Minister Abe, this phase of our relationship, our strategic relationship, when we trust them, as the best partner for the development of the Northeast, or today of the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands, there is this huge trust between our two countries. And I think that's what makes the relationship special. But I think perhaps all this would have remained dormant and under the surface were it not for the personal contribution of Prime Minister Abe.
Right. Swasti, you were a student in Japan for 5 years. Now, an assassination like this, and I'm sure you still have friends there. What does it mean for that country? And I'm sure people are in deep shock and nobody even understands what's going on, because I believe guns are very difficult to get in Japan. So for this man to manufacture a gun and then kill him, what do you think it does?
Well, Jyoti, like I said, that it is absolutely something which is shocking beyond comprehension. I lived in that country for so many years of my, young adult life, and it is, I can vouch with, for it, that it is the safest, one of the safest countries, in the world, whether it's for children or for women or whoever, right? I've seen with my own eyes how children as young as 3 years, 4 years old actually change metros and go to, school themselves, and it's something as quite a spectacle for us, because, you know, here we are so overprotective about our children. I could never think something like that for my own daughter. So it's absolutely extremely unbelievable. Also, I'm hoping it's a freak accident, because Yamagami Tetsuya, who's a resident of Nara, also served at MSDF, which is the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, you know, happened to have some sort of a misgiving about the association of, the Nippon Kaigi group, you know, in LDP politics, etc. So it could be, right? I mean, it's too early for getting those conjectures any serious attention, for giving them any serious attention, but sooner than later we'll find out. But it's something very unheard of. Japan is not like the US gun culture, state. They're extremely difficult to acquire guns. They have the most, I would say, I think the lowest, so to say, percentage of such incidents in the industrialized world. And I would still like to believe it's like a one-off freak accident, but definitely it is going to change Japan in the times to come, because Shinzo Abe wasn't just anybody. Shinzo Abe was, I mean, yesterday I was just, talking to somebody, and I said that Shinzo Abe is a yug purush, okay, for Japan and for the rest of the world today, with respect of what Japan is capable of, right? You see how Japan is countering China and, still maintaining its economic dependence on it, how Japan is backing Taiwan, what Japan has done for the Ukrainian war, how it stood with the Western Bloc, and yet asserted its own identity, in terms of what Japan could mean, and like a whole host of things, right? I mean, how they've just circumvented the Article 9 and, try to sort of gain back that dignity of standing on their own feet when it comes to...
Tell me about Article 9. I mean, you've referred to it a couple of times, but just for my viewers, I want you to explain that.
Article 9, I think, in putting it very in short, you see, when Japan was the survivor of the atom bomb, right, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so after that, and they were occupied by the Allied powers, by US, and the occupation period lasted for about 1945 to 52, when the constitution was, the modern constitution was made, the post-war constitution, where they had an Article 9, which renounced war for all times to come. So basically what it means to say that Japan will never ever take recourse to the military option and would ever go to war with anyone. And Article 9 would ensure that Japan remains a peaceful country. Now, obviously, it's very idealistic and all that. So Japan was only allowed to have something like a self-defense forces. For a long time, they could not leave Japan. They could not go overseas, okay, etc. That also changed in the 90s as the geopolitical situation changed. But all I'm saying is that there is still a very important and a very sizable, so to say, population and support, okay, for Article 9, for maintaining Article 9, because they think that that has been the original personality of what Japan means to the world after the Second World War.
Right.
The point is that it's very naive in today's changing security, situation. The challenges that Japan faces from North Korea to China, and like Ambassador Wadhwa said, that Japan has had a historical baggage, and a negative one at that, with all of its neighbors. With Russia, they have a problem. The 1904, 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, the Kuril Islands problem. With China, they have a problem. With South Korea, there is a problem. With North Korea, of course, it's so very evident. So in such a security challenge, environment, it is very naive to believe that, Japan can totally rely on the security treaty with the US, because we saw that the US was completely retreating under Trump, right? They were retreating from everywhere. So it made definitely all sense in the world. And actually, that is also a point why the period of 2012 to 13 was so important. Shinzo Abe was this man who actually removed the cap of 1% spending of Japan's GDP on the SDF, and said that we need far more money, a bigger money to be spent on SDF, right? And they said that, to modernize them, to build, Japan's anti-ballistic capabilities,
right,
and so forth. So, but again, let's keep in mind the fact that Article 9 still stays, and whatever Shinzo Abe has been able to do, whatever his genius maneuvering has been to kind of circumvent it and not get into that useless debate of, okay, whether should we have it or should we just do away with it.
That's right, and do away with it.
We just kind of contain it and still do whatever is needed to be done.
Yeah. So last couple of questions, Ambassador Wadhwa. Now, both of you have said that Japan played a big role in bringing India around to participate or to play a more active role in the Quad. But can I ask you now, Japan and China, and ostensibly the Quad is meant as sort of a containment strategy of China, although India is not very comfortable with that particular idea. But let's look at Japan a bit. Now, the Japan-China relationship is actually a very close one, especially in economic terms. So how do you see Japan Or, how did Shinzo Abe manage this contradiction?
Jyoti, that will continue. That is a reality, that they have a very, very close, economic relationship. But there is also a theory which talks about, hot economics and cold politics in Japanese, and that is what they followed. So I don't think, during his times, there was a time of I think there was a distinct cooling during the initial years of Prime Minister Abe when he came back into office. This had a lot to do with the Senkakus and then, his various initiatives on the Indo-Pacific and the Quad and so on. And then I think it was in 2018 or so that he went for the 50th anniversary of the establishment of, 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations, when he went to Beijing, and he actually signed on to the BRI. Mm-hmm. You see, so he was also a very practical person in terms of that. So that relationship will be there. And I don't.
So Japan has signed on to the BRI, to the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes. They said they would do joint projects. With China. Of course, nothing took off. That's another story. But the fact that there's also a practicality in relationships, and they're a large, huge neighbor next to them. And just as much as we cannot ignore China, I think neither can Japan. So there's a very multi-layered relationship there. But I want to go back a little bit to, something that you asked, Swasti, which I want to say about what is going to be the impact of this assassination. Though he had stepped down as Prime Minister, and twice the poor man had to step down because of this ulcerative colitis that he had for health reasons. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought he'd come back in 2012, maybe he would come back again. You just felt that he was just too large. He loomed so large over the party. But, he was a kingmaker, whether it was Prime Minister Suga or Prime Minister Kishida. He belonged to one of the largest factions within the LDP. And he's also, I think, he carries a lot of weight in domestic politics as far as the LDP is concerned. And how is that going to be affected? How is it going to affect the party? That's going to be very, very interesting to watch. But the irony of this election was that, he was there, and he was campaigning in Nara. And those campaigns also, it's very interesting in Japan when you see how they campaign. They're just out there. They do have security, some very basic minimum security, but they're there among the people. And you can just walk down the road and suddenly see a politician, who's giving a little speech over there. I think that was what Japan was. And that is what has got shaken now. And I've had friends from Japan, I've written and sent out condolence messages, and they've all come back and said, could this have happened in Japan? Could this have happened, this civilized part of the world? That's completely shaken. What kind of change is that going to bring to Japan? The other thing that was interesting about Prime Minister Abe was that, after he stepped down, he started voicing and speaking of issues which normally were taboo and anathema. You didn't hear. For example, the Japanese policy on nuclear weapons, the Japanese policy on Taiwan. So there were issues that he was talking about that perhaps, made people a bit nervous, but he was daring to talk about it. Right. And again, when you talk about security policy, this whole thing of that you need to have a much more robust, not only a defense policy, but that you should be able to have the right to preemptive strikes. And this is something that he started talking about towards the end. And, there's more talk about Japan carrying out not only defending itself, but also having the capacity to carry out preemptive strikes. So all of that, I don't know where it goes. But I have to say one thing again, Jyoti, which is again something very touching. Just a few months ago, somebody in Japan said to me, "Oh, have you heard the news?" And Prime Minister Abe has said he's going to take over from Prime Minister Modi as the chairperson of the Japan-India Association. The Japan-India Association is the oldest friendship association in Japan, set up in 1903. And several of those who set it up at that point of time went on to become prime ministers and foreign ministers. So it's a very prestigious association. And Prime Minister Abe had come forward and said he wanted to be the next chair, and had just taken over a couple of months ago. So I think when Prime Minister Modi met him in May, he mentioned this, that he'd taken over as the chair. And I was told by somebody who had met him recently saying he's looking very much to come to India in the 70th year of the establishment of relations and to visit India. So, it's really touching that he'd just taken this over, and his commitment to India, absolutely unshaken till the end.
And one quick last question to you, Ambassador Wadhwa, and then Swasti, I'll come to you. From Prime Minister, across prime ministers, across political ideologies, from Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who was is of the Congress party to Prime Minister Modi of the BJP. I mean, both have counted on Shinzo Abe as good friends, not just somebody who promoted the relationship between India and Japan. But how does that happen? Is that, here is this one man who's close to two people of such different ideologies. I mean, speaks of the man, doesn't it?
It speaks of the man. It also speaks of the intrinsic strength of the relationship, which is, I keep saying, I mean, there is complete bipartisan support in both countries across political ideologies and across political parties of the importance of the India-Japan relationship. Right. And I think that is a manifestation we say. And you mentioned, of course, everybody knows the very special relationship that Prime Minister Abe shared with Prime Minister Modi. And it was really a special relationship, inviting him to his personal house and, that there were a lot of gestures. And the fact that, he was here at on each one of his the annual summits, it was something very special that, was put in there at a personal level. That certainly was there. But I also remember the years of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. For example, he came as the chief guest in 2014 on our Republic Day. And I can't tell you how much that meant to him. Because again, you see, Japan's, the whole thing, and we perpetuated it, whether it was the US or even in Southeast Asia, there's a story of Japan, the aggressor in the war. They've never let them forget. And here we were calling him as a chief guest, on our Republic Day, and which is also kind of a military parade in sort of some ways. And I recall his chief cabinet secretary, who later went on to become Prime Minister Suga. He came to me and he said, I never thought I would see the day when the Japanese Prime Minister would be there as a chief guest. It was, and then of course, I mean, he would have been certainly responsible to an extent that when the Emperor, visited India in November 2013, and I mean, there's always a great consultation that goes on with the Prime Minister. So we had two visits like that. And what happened was that, after Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, stepped down in 2014, he was honored with the highest civilian award given to any foreigner. Mm-hmm. So, and this doesn't take away from the relationship with Prime Minister Modi or anything. I think this just talks again about Prime Minister Abe's great commitment to India irrespective.
Right. I mean, I know that you were closely involved with the visit of the Emperor to India as well. But Swasti, I want to ask you about, a quick last question to you about the India-Japan economic relationship. I mean, I remember in 2005, when the Delhi metro had just, when the construction had started, a lot of the money that came from the Japanese ODA, and then Prime Minister Koizumi, who came to Delhi in 2005, and he sort of inaugurated, it was really a real sweet little ceremony in front of Krishi Bhavan, on Rafi Marg in the heart of Delhi. And then, I mean, the India-Japan economic relationship just explodes in some way, doesn't it?
Jyoti, I mean, so this is a bit of a thing that we, I think, need to work on, which is that, yes, India and Japan have tremendous potential when it comes to economic, building up on economic ties and also defense ties. I mean, there's this famous Shinmaiwa, the aircraft that we need to get from Japan, the 12 aircrafts that's stuck, for many reasons. So, we need to understand one thing, that again, when it comes to, exploiting the potential of our economic ties, we have not really been able to do so. It's still very less compared to what we have with other countries like China or something. But the potential is immense. Okay. And let's also understand that one of the things which is going to help this potential, because see, ODA is one thing. ODA is like a loan, it is an assistance. But economic ties, it's about what is our export and import, okay, those kind of things. And it's still about, I think less than $20 billion. If you can check.
Why is it so low?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I was coming to. So there are these two countries that are so close in so many ways. There is an intrinsic friendship, no negative baggage of history whatsoever. Right now, finding themselves together on the same side of history when it comes to taking decisions with respect to protecting, the freedom of seas, the navigation, protecting and championing causes of democracy, free trade, etc. All that on one side, but still that has not been able to translate into a robust, so to say, economic ties. I mean, just plain economy, the money, right? And that is where I think the work now needs to get going. It is on the right track. Why? Because you see, it's not just that one way thing about export import, but it's also that Japan and India find themselves together in so many multilateral forums, okay, especially with respect to how both Japan and the European Union, for instance, are looking at India when it comes to their Indo-Pacific strategy. Okay, so those are things. And then the resilient supply chain initiative that we have with the Australia and Japan, the latest IPEF that America has just launched in the last summit, it was in the Tokyo summit, the Quad summit, right? Okay. And so on and so forth. So it's not just that bilateral environment is very conducive, but also the multilateral push is very much out there to indicate that India and Japan can really come close. As far as balancing ties with China is concerned, Ambassador Wadhwa said it rightly, that economic statecraft will always be a part of, both our, so to say, economic worldviews. But then that is something that we really need to work on, because it's the time is right, okay? And also, I think the last thing that I'd like to say is that she mentioned too that there is bipartisan support to fostering closer India-Japan ties, both in India and Japan. So as far as foreign policy is concerned, we will not see any change. For instance, Fumio Kishida or whoever comes, at least as long as LTP is in power, we will not see a change. But the point is that we will still miss the warmth, the personality, because Japanese are extremely introvert. Japanese are not really like Indians or Americans or Europeans. Japanese are extremely introvert people. You would never expect, Yoshihide Suga to have that kind of a personality connect, with the world. Or for instance, Fumio Kishida. That is where Shinzo Abe kind of just stood apart, okay, from everyone else. So that is going to be missed. He definitely also led the most influential faction within the LDP, and therefore he called the shots, okay, no matter who was the prime minister. So all those things are going to be missed. But as far as continuity of foreign policy and economic policy with India and the rest of the world is concerned, I do not see much change. Okay. But yes, so, I mean, that's what I have to say.
Right. The last words, Ambassador Wadhwa, before.
Very sad day, Jyoti, really, really. I mean, it's really a personal loss, certainly to a lot of us who knew him. And one mourns with Japan, but joins them, because it's not only the loss of a great leader, but also what Japan stands for. Very, very sad day.
On this note, as we mourn the death of a rock star Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, I'd like to thank both of you, Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa and Swasti Rao. Thank you both so much for explaining who this man was. I mean, his charisma, which sort of across the seas and across the continents, shall we say. But I think the phrase that he used in the 2007 speech that will remain with all of us, the confluence of the two seas, India, Japan, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Thank you both so much, Ambassador Wadhwa and Swasti Rao, for joining me on the print debates.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti, and thank you, Swasti.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much, both of you. Thanks again.
Thank you.